My name is Tamar Keburia. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Leibniz Institute for East and Southeast European Studies, IOS in Regensburg, Germany, and a research associate at the Institute for Social and Cultural Research at Ilias State University in Georgia. Besides my academic profession, I am also a member of Movement for Social Democracy, which as of yesterday is officially 1 year old. Happy anniversary to our social movement and to all of us. And what's better way to mark the milestone than by gathering here together for exactly this kind of conversation. Today's event marks our second international webinar in the series titled Contesting Authoritarianism and Transnational Discussion Series. Initiative organized, originally proposed by Dato Gogishvili. Dato is here. Dato, say hi to all of us, who is an urbanist and postdoctoral fellow at the University of Lausanne, and myself, and has since been joined by Iya Eradze, a political economist and researcher at the Davis Center at Harvard University. None of this would be possible without the incredible voluntary work of our community, our social movement group. This series is carried forward by a dedicated group of activists and members of the Movement for Social Democracy. I want to take a moment to name and thank few of them by name: Sofo Verdzeuli, Maria Miekobidze, Biko Kartvelishvili, Vano Abramishvili, who has generously agreed, as I already said, to serve as our interpreter today, along with many more and many others. Your work is a backbone of everything we do here, and thank you once again. The theme of today's discussion is academic freedom in an age of consolidating authoritarianism, and I will be serving as a moderator of today's webinar. And before I introduce our guests, I want to briefly set the stage. We know that Georgia has seen sweeping and deeply troubling changes in the academic landscape. Among the most striking is the systematic dismantling of Ilias State University, one of the country's most prominent institutions. With 90% of its faculties abolished, students' intake on the backbone level slashed by from 3,000 to 5,000 to 200, and master degree intake reduced to 60 only. These developments are significant and they are close to our heart, of course. But today we want to zoom out beyond the Georgian case alone, and instead we want to do something broader. We want to place the question of academic freedom, the question of institutional autonomy and access to the education at the very epicenter of the global authoritarian turn, and approach it through the comparative lens. Over recent decades, we have witnessed a striking and recurring pattern as authoritarian consolidation, universities and academic institutions become frontiers of the resistance, and precisely because of that, they are primary targets of the systematic attack. We saw this in Turkey, we saw this in Hungary, we are seeing it today in United States, but also in Georgia, with an alarming clarity in this so-called higher education deform that we call it unfolding in Georgia. So today we want to ask the following questions. What power do universities actually possess that makes them such a consistent targets? Why does academic practices, teaching, research, thinking critically pose such a fundamental threat to the consolidating authoritarian regimes? And how to turn academic institutions from this kind of enclaves into this kind of open spaces for the emancipatory resistance and power kind of struggles. With these questions in mind, let me now introduce the remarkable people who will be guiding today's conversation. Our first speaker is Sara Bigazzi, a social psychologist based at the University of Pécs, Hungary. Her work focuses on collective processes, social representations, and the social political dimension of knowledge, with particular attention to the power, inequality, and institutional contexts. She has actively engaged in research and teaching at the intersection of critical social psychology, collective action, and the ecological and political crisis shaping our contemporary world. And Sarah will be speaking on the union organizing inside the universities under the authoritarian pressure. Our second speaker is Tamar Tzchadadze, Associate Professor of the Philosophy and Director of the Gender Research Center at the Ilia State University in Tbilisi. Her research spans feminist epistemology, feminist ethics and political theory, gender backlash and anti-gender movements, feminist and queer movements in Georgia, and the gender equality in academia. Tamar has also been a member of the movement for social democracy since its establishment, and Tamar will be speaking on reforming education in Georgia, a tool for political repression, authority policy, or the through social engineering. And lastly, joining us today as a discussant, bringing her insights, critical commentaries, and discussion points to the conversation is Olga Bizyukova. Olga is a social and political anthropologist and currently a research fellow in the Department of Social Anthropology at the University of St. Andrew. Prior to this, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the Brown University and a junior visiting fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences. She received her PhD from the University of Vienna, and her work explores state citizenship relations, agency, displacement, political participation, with particular focus on the Eastern Europe. I want to also briefly acknowledge that our special guest from Turkey was unfortunately unable to join us today, and we will miss her invaluable perspective on the Turkish academic context. However, I have no doubt that with the speakers and discussants we have with us today, conversation will cover the sharp angles and critical points that this moment so urgently necessitates. Lastly, before we begin, a few practicalities I want to quickly somehow cover here. Our speakers will have approximately 15 minutes for their presentation, followed by Olga's discussion points. We will then open the floor for a broader conversation. If you have questions, and I hope you do, please use the chat function to submit it. I will be collecting your questions throughout and bringing them into the discussion at the right moment. So do not hesitate to start typing as we go. And now, without further delay, I would like to invite Olga to share her opinions and remarks, set the stage for the discussion. So Olga, floor is yours. Thank you again.
I thought that the first we go with, I'm sorry, I thought that we first go with the presentation.
But if you have some thoughts like before the presentation begins, you can also comment. If no, we can invite Sarah to share her PPT. Okay, sure. Sarah, can you share your presentation?
Yes, I'm sending a request to
Okay.
share.
So I will ask then Biko and our organizational teams to let the presentation sharing function to the Sarah.
Okay,
Okay, great.
wait a minute. Oh, I'm not able to. Yes.
So we see now your presentation. Can you make it full screen? Great. We see it now
Okay.
on full screen.
So, hello everyone, and thank you for the fantastic introduction by Tamar. I'm not sure that I am remarkable, but yeah, I prepared a kind of presentation which somehow switch between more abstract things related to my thoughts on university autonomy or the autonomy of the academia and the things that happened in Hungary and the things that happened in Page. So I would like to talk about the challenges in organizing resistance to changes threatening university autonomy in Hungary and what this can tell us about academic freedom in more general terms. I will argue that academic freedom depends not only on legal guarantees, but also on the organizational conditions that enable collective resistance within universities. So academic freedom is usually defined as protection from undue influence on independent scholarly judgment. It includes the ability to define research aims, choose methods, cooperate internationally, and question the ethical value of projects. But once we move from definition to measurement, whether through repression events, legal frameworks, expert coding, or self-report data, we begin to see that academic freedom is not only a legal condition, but also a lived institutional practice. I don't know if you can see, probably it's better in this way. So today, I think academic freedom is increasingly shaped by two distinct pressures. On the one hand, we have the market-driven performance regimes, innovation policies, competitiveness logics, impact metrics, and entrepreneurial university models, which reshape research agendas as funding becomes conditional to time horizons shorten, risky or critical research becomes less fundable, non-market disciplines become vulnerable, and autonomy becomes conditional on performance metrics. On the other hand, we have the political ideological governance. Universities are expected to align with national priorities, reflect traditional values, avoid politically sensitive critics, contribute to identity building. This occurs through governance restructuring, leadership appointments, curriculum reform, symbolic delegitimization of academia as elitist or foreign. So academic freedom thus becomes accountable not only to scientific communities, but also to political authority and economic utility. But this situation also forces us to rethink a kind of core assumption that universities can remain neutral. I think that institutional neutrality is largely a myth. The moment academics choose what to research or teach, value-laden decisions are being made. So neutrality simply shifts political positioning from the institutional level to the individual level. Academic freedom, therefore, is not an individual right, but a purposive social responsibility. So it's not an end in itself. It exists only to enable socially valuable goals. It's a privilege tied to responsibility. And then universities are socially embedded institutions. So university has no reason to exist unless it contributes to society in fundamental ways. So truth-seeking, knowledge transmission, and anticipating future social and not market-based needs are all parts of this mission. And then what is I think it's part of this conversation about neutrality that silence is often political, so it supports the dominant values embedded in existing systems. And this produces a structural tension between truth-seeking and politicization. And this tension cannot be resolved through neutrality, only through kind of intellectual honesty, I think. So let's see now the Hungarian context a bit more in broad. That in Hungary, these broader pressures on academic freedom are embedded within a specific political discourse that frames universities as politically and culturally suspect institutions. Government rhetorics increasingly position itself as a defender of the ordinary people against allegedly disconnected liberal elites, among whom universities are frequently included. In this narrative, academic institutions are portrayed as carriers of foreign influence, detached from national interests, and aligned with cosmopolitan or supranational agendas. Educational and cultural reforms are therefore justified as necessary corrective measures aimed at restoring traditional values and strengthening national sovereignty and interest. At the same time, there is a kind of media consolidation that has contributed to the normalization of this framing. While public communication frequently criticizes the European Union and international academic networks as external actors imposing ideological expectations on Hungarian society. As a result, universities are increasingly expected not only to produce knowledge, but to contribute to national identity building and to align with culturally sanctioned narratives. This shift the perceived role of academia from an autonomous critical institution to a publicly accountable national actor. And this has direct implications for what kinds of knowledge can be legitimately produced and by whom. So what you see here is not a sudden rupture in Hungarian higher education, which happened after 2010, but there was also, even before, there were policy intentions to introduce new public management logics into universities. And then in 2000, Fidesz won the elections and came to power. This process accelerated. In 2011, legal changes allowed the minister responsible for higher education to appoint university rectors, effectively inserting executive political authority into what had previously been a self-governing academic procedure. By 2015, the introduction of the consular system institutionalized a kind of dual leadership model. Councillors were appointed directly by the Prime Minister and were granted authority over administration, finance, and management, while rectors retained only the formal responsibility for academic matters. In practice, this created a kind of structural dependency. Academic decisions increasingly became contingent on politically controlled managerial infrastructures. Then in 2017, we had the so-called Lex EU, demonstrated that legal instruments, the law can be used selectively to reshape the academic field itself, forcing the Central European University to relocate most of its operation outside Hungary, so to leave Hungary. From 2018 and onwards, a more systemic transformation began. Public universities were progressively transformed into so-called public interest asset management foundations, a process framed as model change. Formally, this was presented as a privatization aimed at increasing flexibility and competitiveness. Substantively, however, it entailed the transfer of governance rights and public assets into foundation boards, whose members are not publicly accountable and are often politically affiliated with long-term or indefinite mandates. Between 2019 and 2021, the majority of the Hungarian universities underwent this model change, and in effect, national public wealth and institutional governance were moved outside democratic oversight without any compensation into private legal entities. And this restructuring also prompted a European response. In 2022, the EU Council decision to restrict the participation of these model change universities to the different Horizon programs and the Erasmus mobility which means also that people who constructed years and years or decades of international collaboration were not able anymore to work together with others. So let's see about the resistance. So resistance did occur. For example, or the best example is the University of Theatre and Film Art. Their students and staff jointly occupied the university for over 70 days and organized strike actions for more than 100 days. What was crucial? Oh, I'm hearing my voice. Okay, what was crucial here is that it was a very small institute, university, with 500 students and 150 staff. So resistance was enabled with their kind of horizontal organizational structure. So they were able to communicate between each other and also negotiate and prepare plans for new actions. Let's go to my university, which is a bit different because we have 25,000 students and 70,000 employees across 10 faculties and multiple clinical units. And the process of institutional transformation unfolded under very particular condition. 12th of January 2021, the government formally requested that the university initiate the transition to the so-called model change, with the Senate expected to vote within 2 weeks. So that was the period of COVID pandemic under a second state of emergency. We are still in a state of emergency. So social distancing measures, curfews, and public assemblies were prohibited. This meant that any attempt at collective organization had to take place entirely online and within an extremely limited time frame. In contrast to smaller or more horizontally structured institutions, the scale and hierarchical organization of the University of Page made rapid democratic coordination particularly difficult under these pandemic conditions. Despite these constraints, attempts at collective organization emerged almost immediately. So the day after that we had this news, we mainly came to know about it by a journal article. A close Facebook group was organized. University is a public good, and we were mainly 100 participants in it at the first day. Within less than 2 weeks, we organized two large online forums. The first held on the 19th of January brought together nearly 900 participants and included a 2-hour panel with invited speakers of existent model change universities and a 3-hour panel, a 3 hour of plenum with 62 individual contributions and 60 moderators. So it was a huge text and discourse in the online context. Then we organized a second forum held on the 25th of January with approximately 600 participants. It was more structured a bit into 5 thematic sections, the autonomy of science, labor affairs, institutional self-governance, access to education, and the local context. While these forums demonstrated significant interest and engagement, they also highlighted the difficulty of translating dispersed individual concerns into a kind of coordinated collective action within such a compressed time frame. Then what we also have done 2 days before the Senate vote, we conducted a rapid online questionnaire addressed to members of the university community. Within 24 hours, we received 1,490 responses. 78% of the people expressed opposition. These results were printed and placed at the seat of each Senate member on the morning of the vote. However, on the 29th of January 2021, the Senate voted in favor of the model change. 29 in support, 1 abstained, 1 abstention, and only 9 in opposition. This illustrates critical institutional dynamic. While opposition could be expressed, there were no effective mechanisms through which Senate members could be held accountable to the broader university community for their decision. In the absence of such accountability tools, participation did not translate into institutional influence. So this example shows us that mobilization was happening, opposition was visible, deliberation can occur, and still there is a fail at the institutional level, because authoritarian regime is fast and they construct with purpose its tools of accountability. Movements arise and they exist in short terms, but if there is no exercise to resist, exercise to what does it mean being a member of a community, exercise of organizing, listening other voices, and acting with solidarity, these moments of movements are often condemned to fail. So returning a bit to the abstract level, I think that academic freedom cannot be defined individually. It depends on stable collective organization. Union membership can be or beyond crisis moments, or there is behind crisis moments. Recognition of all university staff as knowledge workers. Yet in many Eastern European contexts, and I don't think that it's just East Europe, but academics are often do not identify themselves as workers. So there is a kind of self-exploitation also. That collective action is individual activity, and collective actions are episodic and mainly based on moments of threat or crisis. And another problem is very much the hierarchical institutional cultures, which often marginalize administrative labor, but also the young generations, doctoral students or postdoctoral students as well. So this brings us somehow to a potential role that trade unions as can be or can be changed or can bring this kind of role inside the universities. So trade unions do not only defend rights legally, they can reshape institutional interaction through everyday practices of consultation, representation, interactions, mainly rendering authorities accountable, showing institutionalized contestations, also normalizing somehow dissent. So they can create micro democratic spaces within otherwise hierarchical organizations. And these spaces reduce self-censorship, strategic silence, compliance with political or market agendas, while enabling from the focus of academic autonomy, epistemic risk-taking, or critical inquiry as well. So in this way, academic autonomy emerges not only from legal guarantees, but from democratized institutional relations. So, and this is my last slide mainly. Academic is often framed as an individual right, this academic freedom, but in practice, it is a collectively enacted institutional condition where academics do not identify as workers and democratic interactions are more and more absent. Academic freedom becomes politically vulnerable to both ideological control and market governance. So academic freedom is therefore not only secured by law, but enacted in everyday democratic interactions And trade unions, I think, has the potential to become the institutional actor capable of making such interactions structurally possible. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you a lot, Sarah. This was very important point on the academic freedom in practice, basically, what we have heard. And with this, I'm going to give the floor to Tamar Tkadadze. I'm going to ask our administration to let Tamar share her presentation if she has some. And then I'm going to pass the floor to Olga.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much. And Sarah, thank you. It was really very interesting and inspiring and very general. I will share my PowerPoint, but to be honest, it's nothing fancy. It's just notes for me to follow. Maybe I'm not even sure it's worth sharing, but I will venture. How to do this? Can you see that?
We can see it. Can you make it full screen, Tamar?
Yes, sure. So to make it full screen, I go there. I'm sorry, I'm not sure I can. Now? Oh. Okay, anyway, so my presentation, and I have 20 minutes, right? Hello, and thank you, Sarah, for setting this very useful general theoretical framework together along with this Hungarian particular case. When I was preparing for this intervention today, I had these many different dilemmas, what to concentrate on the one hand, because we are just right now in the middle of this fight, in the middle of actual crackdown on our university, facing closing down. I had this dilemma whether to just go in the direction of speculations on academic freedom or devote more time to some empirical facts describing what we are now experiencing. So I decided to go into second one, but I will try to add some general remarks in the end too. So as Tamar already mentioned in the beginning of our discussion, our government announced a couple of months ago in October 2025, and what later came to be called education reform, what they call reform. It was just a 4-page concept of education reform, and rationalists that they announced for this really drastic overhaul in our education system, especially in higher education, were several actually that they named. I just brought those here. One was that according to them, there are too many students concentrated in the capital city, Tbilisi, too many students and too many universities. So they decided that deconcentrating geographically higher education was a noble goal to pursue, and that was one aspect that they suggested to improve by their reforms. Another one was optimization of resources and improving quality of education. And in that aspect too, their main grievance was that on the one hand, general quality of education, but on the other hand, inequality in terms of quality of education among different universities. So that's at least their story. Another was systematizing faculty hiring policies and making it more transparent, which is probably the most vague point in their reform concept. then linking research to teaching and improving academic programs and also teaching materials. Then linking education system with labor market and somehow harmonizing our education system with the demand of labor market. And then revision of funding system of higher education and improving the infrastructure of higher education institutions. Those were 7 noble goals that this reform was supposed to serve. However, and one more was optimization of quality. Of resources. Okay. If you look at these goals, of course, what's not to like, right? Almost all of them look like legitimate goals for reform. However, the reform, as soon as it was announced, it caused a huge outrage in Georgian public, especially probably in the public that was already protesting the governance by Georgian Dream, especially through last 2 years, especially probably since the elections in 2024, but also the announcement of by our prime minister that Georgia was stopping negotiations for European integration. But anyway, at least in this protesting public, the reform announcement was a huge outrage. However, it was also it had a quite big resonance in the whole Georgian society as well. So I just tried to sketch some, not all of the preliminaries that led to this reform, which are not obviously connected with this education reform, but still are very important to understand the context in which this education reform caused such a sharp reaction and huge resonance in Georgian society. On the one hand, probably many of you know that Georgian Dream government started already in 2023 this what they call transparency laws, which was virtually a crackdown on civil society organizations in Georgia. It caused huge protest waves in 2023. Those protests were successful. The Georgian government took back this proposed legislation, but in 2024, in July, they still passed this law in face of huge public protests. Then in 2024, within very much in the same context, they also passed this law of Georgia on the protection of family values and minors, and this law is virtually virtually the same as the law, this actually set of laws which we know in many different countries and are known like anti-LGBTQ rights laws, or as in some contexts they frame it, those anti-LGBTQ propaganda laws in their terms. So this law itself, probably I could have made my contribution today focus on this law only, because if we talk about academic freedom, probably this law has the most direct relevance for academic freedom as such, because this law actually regulates and severely determines what can be taught at not only at schools, but also at higher education institutions. And also the reactions to this law in Georgian society are a topic of very interesting reflections, how actually our oppositional segments of society decided not to talk much about, not to oppose to this law, because they saw this law as a stunt by Georgian Dream government to involve protesting society into debates about LGBTQ rights and to discredit these protests in the eyes of the wider segments of Georgian society. Anyway, that's very interesting topic. One interesting aspect of this law is that if anybody opposed to this law, they dare to oppose to this law, not as a law against LGBTQ rights, but as a law of censorship. And the main argument that you could hear against this law in Georgian society publicly were arguments against this law as a law for censorship. But that, I will come back to this story later in my presentation. Anyway, so in November 2024, Euro integration process was arrested, and following that we had huge public protests, and probably we are in permanent political crisis in Georgia ever since. So in 2025, our government announced already in spring that they were preparing some drastic reforms for higher education. They even announced a commission for education reform, which constituted of several ministers and no experts, no university rectors, nobody really active in education, in the sphere of education, just various ministers of like interior, minister of infrastructure, so on and so on, of course, minister of education too. So, and eventually in, I missed this one point, eventually in October, they announced this this conception of reform that I talked previously. So the first reaction to this reform was that it was, why I told this preliminary development is that it was very obvious from the very start that this education reform should be read in the context of this general political crisis, and in the context, and also in this context of general crackdown on civil society, on protesting segments of the public, and it was also declared by the government that by this reform they would deal with some universities that were in their terms they were like radicals or were foreign agents and so on. So, and one more interesting aspect of this very general concept that was just 4 pages, as I said, in the background of those noble goals that it announced was that it envisaged no increases in budget allocations or anything in this sense, or it was not tied to any visions or any plans of reforms in other spheres, like in economy, when they were talking about like demand of labor market and so on. So this was just very, very general first reaction. However, one thing probably to be noticed, important to be noticed, is that actually they have this, also our government has this specific technique of releasing information bit by bit, right? One interesting, one possible question about it is that whether it's a technology for them somehow to control the backlash, or maybe, and quite plausibly, they are just thinking of those details along as they go and adjusting as they go. So that's why they cannot really announce all their plans, all of their plans at the beginning and at once. However, both of those hypotheses, whether it's a technology to govern and to manage the reaction, or it's just about adjusting by trial and error, but both of them can be true at the same time. Anyway, and so just to give you a little context about Georgian higher education system, it's very complicated, and of course I cannot have any ambitions to give you any detailed picture. Just several aspects that I want to highlight to understand what this reform is now about and how it is connected to the autonomy of universities, how it's connected to other aspects that I want to emphasize in this context. One thing about Georgian higher education system, which may be not so intuitive for those who are not familiar with this, is that public universities have been functioning in Georgia very much like private universities. They have this public status, which means that their property is public. They are registered as different legal entities. The state has certain mechanisms of control over public universities. And when I say certain, I don't mean that they are weak or little. And over the years, over last year, especially under Georgian Dream government, there were several legislations passed that actually made public universities more and more dependent on the Ministry of Education and on the government. However, when I say that public universities mostly function as private universities, I mean how they are funded and how they operate, how they are funded and how they operate. Generally, the main income of public universities as well as private universities in Georgia is tuition fees that students pay. This tuition grant system. And this tuition grant system, after this previous big reform in our education that was launched in 2005 under the United National Movement government, so changed this tuition grant system in a way that this fellowship or tuition grant follows the students. So not if students go to private universities, their tuition grant is paid by the state to private universities. So, and there are some other provisions for students. So the tuition grants, there are several sources for students to get tuition grants. So one is main one is through central national examination system. Another one is the social tied to social status. But anyway, it's not tied to the status of the university. This public funding can go both to private as well as public universities, depending where students that obtain this grant goes. And so following this, actually, most public universities depend on the state funding in very low degrees, like Ilia State University, which is now the main target of this education reform. Had its budget, only 2% of its budget came from state funds. This, of course, allowed universities, even public universities, much more freedom than you can imagine. Of course, there were various instruments in the hand of the government, like not probably very transparent decisions in the accreditation agency and so on. However, within themselves, public universities functioned quite like corporations. Like when I say that, I mean that even public universities have no obligation to have transparent salary systems. They are free to put into employment contracts that professor, they can oblige put into contract with professors that professors are not allowed to make their salaries public and so on. So those things are very important to understand, but also this dependency, financial independency of public universities on even public universities on the state funding. So that's very important now to understand those devious instruments through which the government is now cracking down on the university. So before now, my thesis actually, which I brought into my title, included these three possibilities, as you saw, that I am asking whether this new reform that they announced should be interpreted as another step in political repressions and instrument of political control of unwanted actors in the public field, like previously these were civil society organizations. After that, the government cracked down on public servant sector by laws, and also with huge layoffs based on political positions. There were other cases in which the government actually cracked down on different segments of protesters by these economic means, I would say, like there were cases in Fiatura when they laid off miners and so on. So one horn of the trilemma is that whether these reforms are political repressions and means of political control. Another is that these are, as you could see from what I already said in their goals, is that whether this reform and this set of reforms is actually aimed at some kind of austerity policy, reducing public spending on higher education or education system generally. And the third one is also explicit in their announcements, social engineering. However, what I want to say now is that actually those three possibilities are not mutually exclusive, and these authoritarian systems actually can operate in a way that they can aim and achieve and use all those three directions in a way that those three are actually mutually reinforcing at the same time. And now I will try to elaborate on that. So as I said, there can be many arguments, but I will just restrict myself with emphasizing that one thing is that their announcement of this reform was preceded by very aggressive propaganda against universities, especially against the Ilia State University, but also some other universities. And in this propaganda portrayed these universities as centers of political radicalization, as centers of this liberal ideology or whatever you want. Another thing was that what you can see when you really project and somehow try to calculate what the results of these reforms will be, it will be layoffs and loss of jobs of faculty, mostly of at those universities or departments at various universities that may be politically unwelcome for our government. And this, as I already mentioned, these economic repressions are very, very signature tactics of our government. That also is interesting to emphasize. And in this respect, actually, and now I want to ask this question: when we talk about most criticism of this reform now actually goes under the rubric of institutional autonomy. Not so much, I would say, academic freedom, but institutional autonomy. Sometimes you can see that people assume some kind of equation between those two: academic freedom, institutional autonomy of universities. However, I would want to problematize this in our today's discussion, what it means in today's setup to fight for institutional autonomy of universities that mostly function as corporations, and whether it is the same as fight for academic freedom. So that's my first question, to which I don't have a clear answer, but that's something that I want to pay attention to. So another possible rationale, as I said, was of this reform was, and quite obvious, actually, not possible, is reduction in public spending and privatization of the university buildings. So if you ask the government, they say that no, they are not reducing funds allocated for education. However, on the other hand, they also did not announce an increase. However, they are reducing schooling years by totally 3 years in total. So by 1 year at secondary level, 1 year at BA level, and 1 year at master's level. That's already a big reduction, you would agree. Then another very strange principle that they announced was that is this under the heading of optimization, one department per one city, which they cannot, actually they are saying that this is well-established principle of organizing higher education and universities in European cities. However, as far as I know, and most of my acquaintances know, there is no such principle in no countries, not to say anything about European countries. So, which will of course result in reduction of faculty size. And then of course they have already announced this, their plans to sell buildings, campuses of universities that have very lucrative locations in the center of Tbilisi. And then another interesting question is reduction of student enrollments. Actually, the later bit of information that we received just less than a week ago was that they announced these quotas for public universities that show that eventually they received some backlash and did not really mechanically reduce so drastically the number of university places they are announcing. However, they are rearranging them in a way that guarantees that we will have fewer enrollments in this year. So, and now, again, but they are packaging this reform under the argument that now they are also suspending this tuition grant system. Previously, students were able to take their tuition grants to private universities. Now they are stopping that and restricting all tuitions, public state tuitions to public universities, and they are packaging it as free education. They are saying that now no public university will have paid places for students. They will finance all public university places. However, and that however, it's very obvious that this enrollment will be reduced after this year. So, and the last thing, the last aspect I wanted to, how much time do I have, Tamar? 2 minutes. Okay. Yeah. Another rationale that they are giving for this reform is this labor market demands. They are referring again and again to some market study, which they never published, this government, but they are saying that our education system does not meet demands of labor market. Yeah. And not officially, not in official documents, but talking heads of our government then and in many different occasions say that we are having too many students and our labor market doesn't demand so many higher educated people with higher education. So that's one theme that is actually goes through in their argumentations. Another thing is that they are also insisting that the distribution of our students in various professions also one thing is that there are too many students, more than labor market demands. Another is that distribution of our students in various specializations and professions, again, doesn't match demands of labor market because we apparently don't need so many philosophers or sociologists or lawyers and so on. That's another thing. So that's one obvious trend in their rationalizing this reform, that somehow student bodies should match demands of labor market. However, there is another interesting trend in their rhetoric that they are also trying, at least their ambition is somehow to reform the imagination of Georgian society, in their own words, to curb exaggerated pursuit or over-valorization of higher education in Georgian society. So that's a big topic in Georgian society. You can hear quite frequently that, or why do Georgians want to get higher education and so much, and why do have? So they are capitalizing on this perception that Georgians generally are a bit too much oriented on getting. And I will just
maybe we have to get to the discussion part, and then we can also get to the previous cases of astral linguistics.
I spent too much time on this description of the context. I'm sorry. Just I wanted to ask these 2 or 3 questions about the possibility of resistance. Now, one thing is that in this situation in which we don't have any preliminaries for collective action among, so, and it's only about it's translated, all this crackdown is translated in and interpreted, and it is actually a political crackdown, political repression of unwanted actors. In this context, what are the prospects in Georgian society to organize collectively? Like, we don't have any strong unions in academic sphere, and as I said, even public universities function very much as kind of neoliberal corporations. So that's one very interesting question for me, and Sarah actually already answered to these questions. And another thing is that how to understand these technologies of power that Georgian Dream is using, but you can also see in many different contexts in these authoritarian consolidation cases of authoritarian consolidation, in which these authoritarian governments actually are governing us through this outrage. In many cases, they are just starting processes that they know that will cause outrage in the public. However, they somehow are managing to capitalize on it. So that's my another question, which I would like to discuss in this. So I'm sorry, I used more time, I think, than. How to start? Sorry.
Thank you, Tamar. Now I'm going to ask Olga to step in, and then we're gonna open later the discussion and collect the questions, but also turn our event into the roundtable discussion rather.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Tamar, and all other co-organizers for convening this panel and inviting these excellent speakers, and for also inviting me to be part of it. It's a great pleasure and honor, especially considering the urgency and importance of this topic of attacks on academic freedom and institutional autonomy in the context of authoritarian regimes. And of course, as we speak, we can see that these attacks are actually acquiring a global scale. They're taking place not in isolated places, in some separate countries, while of course each case has specificities, but still we can see this trend globally. And so, moreover, we can see that these authoritarian regimes and these political forces that promote authoritarianism, they are not simply exist in parallel with each other, but that they form actually a group that support each other, that cooperate, and even enable existence of each other. Of course, we can think about Georgian Dream, whose actually dream it is. We can think about the multiple political alliances that Hungary is under Orban, that Orban government is forging. And of course, we can also observe how these regimes are actually learning from each other, and sometimes also actively adopting strategies, concrete instruments, toolkits, and of course, in the context of the shared ideological reactionary agenda that they share in common and that they push, and actually which is now increasingly becoming, in a way, a political mainstream. And so, of course, as such examples, they multiply, they become more visible. It also reveals the actual connections and the actual exchanges between such regime and between such forces. And of course, we can think about Hungary as a kind of forerunner in these terms in Europe, with attacks that Sarah, in this extremely rich presentation, described, that started well before, like from the very beginning, basically, of Orban coming in power. And of course, with the CU as the first target of attacks, which then expanded to other Hungarian universities. But then how actually Hungary, Orban regime and its government, how they were praised by reactionary forces in United States. And for example, I recently witnessed a very interesting talk on how actually initially Florida adopted Hungarian strategy to rework the system of higher education in Florida, and how now we actually can see how this toolkit is expanded at the scale of the United States, and with J.D. Vance explicitly praising Orban for his treatment and his approach to higher education. And I thought that it's just important, of course, to make this to make these connections. And of course, I think what is another aspect that that both speakers addressed in their presentation, but which I wanted to emphasize in a way again, that the current moment also showed how, in a way, for quite some time, especially in the post-Cold War era, academic freedom and institutional autonomy were taken for granted, and how very often academic freedom and remained actually rather a declarative aspiration, and that actually when push came to shove, it turned out that there were actually basically no actual legislative protection and effective mechanisms that would allow to actually sanction and counteract attacks on academic freedom. So this is, of course, example of Hungary that basically had hard time, and European Union that had hard times to find even the legal basis on which to challenge the Orban attack, initially against you, but also against the higher education. And it's also only actually in rather recent time that there are not first attempt, but let's say some more systematic attempts to even codify and define academic freedom in legal terms, and they also go in a very sometimes interesting and ambiguous directions, let's say. And of course, the state of institutional autonomy is another dilemma that was often under-reflected, that was often didn't receive attention, and in a way how the current moment shows, and how also both speakers showed in their presentation, that both public universities and private universities, they have their pitfalls. And what often probably, I think that what this panel also, why it is so important, that it allows us to recenter what often we forget in the fights for democracy. In the fights for democracy, somehow the question of academic freedom and institutional autonomy is taken for granted as some kind of secondary and almost automatic byproduct of this process. And what basically we now learning hard way, that it's not necessarily occur in this automatic and natural manner, and that we cannot rely simply on a kind of natural or existing restraint and existing compliance of the governments with some declarative principles. So that I think that now it's precisely important to understand the relationship between democracy and academic freedom and institutional autonomy in a substantive way. And of course, why this panel I think is so important is, of course, precisely that the attacks, they also in a way reveal the lack of awareness, also broadly in academic community and in among institutions, sometimes the lack of preparedness, and among the broader public to recognize actually the gravity of threat and of what is going on. And probably now most of those who participate on this panel already lived through rather hard times. But for example, we can see now what is going on in the US, how there is also the lack of understanding and the lack of comprehension of what basically we are dealing with. And so I think that this is precisely the importance of also self-education, of raising awareness, but also of creating the venues for exchange, for dialogue, is what such panels and such meetings they allow for. And so I wanted to thank again you and all other participants for this opportunity. And I would like to open our sort of short format roundtable, where I will start with a few first questions, and then you will direct me when we opening the floor to questions from the public. But I wanted to again address Sarah and Tamar, and thank you very much for your extremely informative and rich presentations. And I wanted to ask, maybe to recap a bit, about the dynamics that you're witnessing now in the context of the respective countries, but also, of course, in the wider context about what do we see new about what is new about these attacks on academic freedom and institutional autonomy, but what also maybe are some historical continuities with the previous record of state attacks and subordination of universities to basically government and state ideology. Because on the one hand, we can see that in many places there are certain histories and certain records of such attacks, but on the other hand, I wanted to ask you about what are the innovations of these current regimes, these current authoritarian governments, in terms of the objectives, in terms of the tools and instruments with which they operate. And I think you both already kind of addressed these questions in your presentations, but I wanted maybe to invite you to recap it again. Thank you very much.
Tamar, can you start?
Oh, okay. Actually, I'm very sorry that I did not really concentrate on academic freedom at all. I realized, but it was very difficult for me because, as I said, actually, there are more complicated connections with academic freedom than any direct ones in our current situation. And I'm saying this because except this one case, which I mentioned, that this in case of anti-LGBTQ propaganda or whatever. That was probably the only obvious case of the crackdown on academic freedom in this narrow sense, I would say. However, of course, and Sarah really very wonderfully outlined in her presentation, and also there was a study, very interesting study in 22, empirical study of how academics in Georgia perceive academic freedom. And it was interesting that none of the respondents mentioned union and union struggle at all in their responses about academic freedom. However, they mentioned two aspects: political intervention and political repressions, and another was managerialization of university. Those two were mentioned. However, still, as Georgia especially, but maybe Hungary also has some affinities with that, that we know that we are coming, our university system is coming from this long Soviet legacy. However, I don't really want to say that it's, we know that if you look at the history of Europe, like censorship was very ubiquitous practice all over the continents of Europe, you could say, and so academics have to fly and do books there. But if you really mean by academic freedom only this, and under Soviet Union, we had this experience of this state control of what you could research or what you could publish. This, and starting from 90s, in this respect, we had some kind of total freedom. If you take, if you look at academic freedom in this as negative, in philosophy we distinguish between this negative and positive freedom, right? If you look at academic freedom only in this sense of negative freedom, maybe from 90s we had enjoyed this total freedom in negative sense, and maybe this anti-LGBTQ law was the first case in Georgian case when it was actually legalized to somehow restrict this freedom, unfortunately. And as I said, the fight of Georgian academics against it was not really non-existent, I would say. Not that it was not successful, but non-existent. So anyway, so to say that, on the other hand, if you really broaden this concept of academic freedom to positive freedom, like what academics actually can do, what power they possess, in these terms, I would say that all or most development of Georgian higher education system, starting from this independent year, has been some kind of, I could not say the decline in this, but this local power of academics in institutions was very limited from the very start, and probably there are institutions vary from one to another, like in terms of what powers academics possess and what's the ratio of administration or management versus academic or faculty. However, I would say that this collective positive notion of academic freedom is very weak in Georgia still. And now in this crackdown, now what is interesting now, what we are witnessing and what is really interesting for me is that in this situation now, we are in the situation that we have to fight for our academic institutions and for their autonomy in this situation when we don't have any independent so just I will stop now and say something about just one example for me about this positive power, positive sense of academic freedom. Starting from 2005, this reform, Georgian education reform, based on which now universities are organized, private as well as public, one important thing about it was that they virtually abolished departments, specialized departments. So like before that we had like Department of Philosophy, Department of Sociology or whatever, like this, right? And all those went under one big faculty. Like at my university, we have this huge faculty of arts and sciences, by which professors are hired separately as individuals. So collective or disciplinary collective, like philosophers, what would be Department of Philosophy, have no power about budgeting decisions, about hiring decisions, about promoting decisions. That's what I say. That disciplinary communities that should be main drivers of academic freedom in this positive sense are totally powerless in Georgian context. That's the degree of managerialism that we have already achieved in Georgian context. And in this context now, what is interesting that we are still in this sense, autonomy of our universities is still the last thing that we have to fight. However, now our universities are facing the situation that faculty is totally powerless. And we have this kind of powerless situation. And by powerless, I mean that we have been kind of employees of the university, not really owners of universities. So in this situation, of course, it's more difficult to wage war against authoritarian regimes who want now to subdue these institutions, however good or not ideal they are. So that's kind of, I don't know whether I answered your question, but those are dilemmas actually that you are very, very hard dilemmas that you face in this context.
I would say something similar to Tamar discussion, but I would put it in like it's about culture. So old ways of existence inside the academia return very easily, right? Because we have so they are fixed. We didn't change generations or interacting in different ways for so many times to learn a new way of making academia. So it's very easy to return to the old way somehow. And then and then cultural change is not just how to make academia. We didn't really learn, or it was not generations and generations learning how to make democracy in everyday practices and in everyday interactions. And then, we had democracy, we had the Academy of Freedom, but we didn't constructed our institutions how to do that strongly. So the Senate voted, and 1 year later, in the University of Page, the Senate just gives an opinion, and the foundation, the 5 politicians decide what is good or not for the university. So, but cultural change is also related to trade unions, okay? Because when we had the model change, the union inside the university was a kind of service provider union, which means, the holiday package or Christmas things and these kind of things, and not bottom-up organizing and learning small exercises of resistance. Okay, and this is what we are doing now. It's how to create small campaigns that people can express solidarity and can make small actions, writing in a Google sheet his name that he's okay with this kind of change, you know. And what is interesting here, and I would also somehow connect to one of the questions in the chat, is that it's on this quick that authoritarian governments give you quicks and even quick new politics, and they just give you 4 pages like in the Georgian case, or we have 15 pages of PowerPoints. It's even not important, in 1 week you do it and that's it. And we did so. Even if we say no, it's not enough, and we didn't learn how to organize and how to not be just reactive, but sometimes it's not important to be reactive, but do the organization inside, even if things are happening outside. You should do this organizational work inside, even sometimes not going to the news to make an interview, but unless talk with other 15 people. That's more important, because in this way you are connected with your community, which a lot of time universities are not real collectivities. I mean, they are departments here and there, but people do not know each other a lot of time. That's happening. Yeah. So culture change everywhere. It's really very difficult. It needs times, as democratic practices needs time too. So I don't know, Olga, if it was an answer to your question.
Thank you. Of course, it was very rich answers. I hope that we still have time. I wanted to check with Tamar until when.
We have 10-15 minutes left, but for now, the unfortunate thing is that our interpreter Vano has to leave, but we're gonna continue this conversation for 10-15 minutes more. I'm gonna ask our speakers to keep their answers short, that we also manage to receive the questions from the auditorium, and also Olga has the opportunity to pose her questions.
I will not then pose all the questions that I thought. I will just try to formulate one question as a kind of a bit of potpourri question, and somehow to echo also questions from the chat. But as we are dealing with the situation in which this attack on academic freedom, they often both use in their rhetoric and in their instrument a political language of accountability, of efficiency, of excellence on the one hand. On the other hand, we can see that they are also this tendency is really can be observed at the global scale, so that it's really across the board. So in this context, precisely what could be effective strategies of resisting and counteracting? And if we speak about the forms of organization, at what scale we can envisage these forms of self-organization, whether it is small action at the level university, or it requires actually cooperation of universities, or actually it requires cross-national also movement that would have some organizational structure. So if you could share your ideas and maybe your experience to this point. Thank you very much.
I would start now and make it short, or try to make it short. I would like to make a point, because I think there is a difference between global north or let's say Western countries and East European countries, at least on mobilize or resistance. And psychology has made this kind of general theorization sometimes, and they say that the perception of unjustness move people. Okay, so make them start resisting or doing like this. And it seems that in Eastern Europe, everybody thinks that system is unjust, but when people move, it's when they think that it's unstable, so it's changeable. So there is the possibility of change. I think it's important also in the communication. The second, we try to do that. So we have internal organization inside the university. Then because of the model change and these attacks, there is a kind of communication between the trade unions at the national level. And also I am part of these organizer communities. So not just sectorial issues related to academics, but also in a more wider, so people working in for-profit systems. And also we have a kind of East European organizers meeting once a year. But it's a lot of levels, but I feel all the time so it's a nice feeling when you feel that, okay, you are making these kind of efforts, but there are also geopolitical issues here, why it's happening, these kind of things also for the academia somehow. So why they are reducing the number of students at the universities, why they don't want a, intelligence way of industry, but more kind of assemblage industry here. And yeah, I think I taken short it. Tamar, it's your turn, I think. No, I mean microphone is closed.
I'm sorry. Yeah. So it's now just to share with you that now some of us are trying to start. Maybe it's too late now, but you and I. On the other hand, we have this quite not very good laws about the strikes and the possibilities with to fight with strikes, and these typically union instruments is quite difficult here. But as I said, also like we have this situation in which we have to fight to rescue our institutions, and most instruments that can be used by unions, at least by Georgian legislation, are instruments that you can use as leverages against your employers. So that's the kind of very difficult dilemma for fighting against this crackdown through typical instruments of unionization. However, we do hope. Another predicament that I would mention, I'm sorry, I'm only mentioning predicaments and nothing really giving hope, I'm afraid, but I will try to say something about that too. So another predicament is, of course, this general political situation, which per my observation is this general technology of governance now in these authoritarian regimes, is that all these protests are now translated into one big fight, pro-government and against government. And in this situation, it actually makes it very difficult to consolidate and somehow against this crackdown in academia, because every protest is translated into into anti-government protest. And so this Georgian dream actually over these last few years especially, but it has started earlier, managed to structure this political field in a way that everything is about pro or against, and society is also polarized along those lines. So this, of course, makes it difficult to consolidate, even though I am sure that, of course, you have academics that are on both sides that are against this reform. So those, just to mention too. On the other hand, of course, yes, we have to try and learn from each other. What we see is that these authoritarian regimes, they really learn from each other, share resources among each other, and we of course also need to somehow make our struggle into some kind of also use internationalization and learn from each other. That's very general what I can. But again, to come back, I do believe that we have to start. I have no particular prescription how to do it, but we have to find some some condensations or some knots of power. We have to find power at different levels, like where from which we can resist, like be it in some kind of disciplinary solidarity in some case, institutional solidarity in other case, maybe some. That's how I think. Maybe it's very general. Of course, unionization may help, but so of course, because what I'm saying is that in many cases, they have just this case of anti-LGBTQ law was very, very, very good example of that. That in some cases, struggle for one cause is impossible because it is placed in this general dualistic frame, and you are thinking and the public generally is thinking in these terms whether would struggle for this cause harm or benefit the only struggle which is now central in Georgia, like anti government. So which I think that's the case in some cases. You can see something similar in the case of United States. I'm not sure about Hungary, but so recent politics of United States and how I think that they are. So in this connection, when I mentioned this, can I add? There is Charles Fairbank's answer that how they. That's actually what I meant by this governing by outrage. That actually my observation is that it has probably been theorized already, and I'm sorry for sharing this just low level empirical observation, but these new authoritarian governments, they are somehow effective, not facing backlash, but rather capitalizing on their actions that causes outrage in the segments of societies that are opposed to them. That's very interesting. So, and in this case too, like they are dropping something in case of education, and part of the public that is against them is very loud against this change. And this actually somehow, through some machinations of power, consolidates their base and consolidates their power. Maybe I'm saying something very, very pessimistic now by mentioning this, but that's the fact that I meant by this governing by outrage. So that just to answer this question.
Thank you very much. Tamar, would you like to open the floor if there are, because I see that participants already started leaving, and maybe there are some who still wait to ask their question from the speaker.
Yes, I think most of our speakers have already addressed the majority of questions. There is one question, specific one, which I want to ask maybe. So Sarah has already asked Natia Mjavanadze's question, as I understood it, and Tamar Tkadadze has already asked Charles Fairbank's question, but there is Esma Gumberidze's question, which haven't been covered maybe, and I'm going to read it out. This is, what about so-called foreign agents law? Won't they impact universities' capacity to attract the foreign funding necessary for research, especially for the public universities? Although we have talked a lot about this question, maybe just saying a very few words about this, and we're going to leave our audience to leave the discussion, because yes, we are like quite in overtime right now. but it has been very interesting discussion, and it also shows and signals how important this theme and this topic is. Tamar, so you can take maybe 2-3 sentences, and I'm gonna give Olga the final summarizing, maybe if she wants to.
Yeah, actually, that's another problem that our government spends too little on education and research, especially higher education and research. And of course, a lot of research done in Georgia was depending on foreign funding, and that again, so in these terms, crackdown on academic community in Georgia started even before this education reform, so already with this foreign agent laws in Santos. However, of course, that's another a topic for another very big discussion, how in a context like Georgia, academia and the civil society work was interconnected, how this funding that was coming into Georgia for civil society was also funding academic work, and how academia was structured in these terms differently than in some probably Western societies. So those are interesting questions, but probably I wouldn't go into those now.
Thank you so much. Thanks to our speakers, to Tamar Tzadadze, to Sara Bigastis, to Olga Bizyukova. This was like really interesting, very necessary discussion. Thanks for the people staying till the very end of this discussion. As you can see, we have recorded the discussion. We're gonna put it on our Facebook channel. If you cannot somehow manage or want to go back to the discussion, you can still watch it for a few more days. We're going to continue our discussion series, and we're going to be active on our Facebook channel. So please follow us, subscribe our YouTube channel, and thank you again to all of you attending and participating and for your input. This is very valuable for us, as I already mentioned that Georgia is facing a very hard situation. So your contribution, your voluntary contribution really means a lot.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.